Why was Alaska sold? The worst real estate deal in history happened on the 30th of March, 1867. 1.5 million square kilometers. 2 cents an acre. The people selling had no clue what was underground. The oil alone, found decades later, was worth more than the empire's entire yearly budget by a lot. Now, before you conclude these guys were idiots, or that the whole thing was rigged, or that there was some secret lease Khrushchev quietly let expire in a handshake deal with Kennedy, I want to walk through what they actually knew, because the real story makes a harder argument than any of the conspiracy theories. It's about the difference between a bad decision and an unlucky one, and those two things are not the same, even if the outcome looks identical. Let's start at the beginning. What even is Alaska? The name is Aleut. It means the Great Land, and it earns it. Kodiak Island is the second largest island in the United States after Hawaii. The chains of islands stretch nearly 1,700 kilometers. The continental portion is a peninsula 700 kilometers long, more volcanoes than the rest of the United States combined, and the glaciers cover 41,440 square kilometers. For scale, that's the whole of the Netherlands, just frozen. Quick question. If someone called you tomorrow and said, I can sell you the second most oil-rich state in America for the price of a decent apartment building, would you pick up? Because that is, in hindsight, what the United States was offered.
And a significant chunk of Congress wanted to say no.
The land had been home for thousands of years. Aleuts, Eskimos, various indigenous peoples, salmon, cod, herring, sea lions, seals.
And one animal that I'm going to come back to because it ends up being the reason everything collapses.
The sea otter. It gets its own section. It deserves it. The first Europeans who might have seen Alaska's coast were Semyon Dezhnyov's crew in 1648 sailing the Bering Strait from one ocean to the other. They apparently spotted the shoreline, never landed. Peter the Great ordered expeditions to map the Pacific edge of the empire. Vitus Bering ran the same strait Dezhnyov had crossed.
But visibility was bad, and he missed the American continent entirely.
Alaska was formally registered as Russian territory in 1732, when Mikhail Gvozdev ship St. Gabriel crossed the Bering Strait and the first Russians actually set foot on Alaskan soil. Bering came back in 1741, landed on the Aleutian Islands, and confirmed what the earlier expedition had only sketched out. Lightly armed locals, fish, animals, room to build something, what nobody puts on a plaque anywhere. At the peak of the Russian push south, there was a fort less than 100 kilometers from present-day San Francisco. Russia briefly held both ends of the Pacific coast of North America. How far this went before it fell apart. And so the development of Russian Alaska began. New territory opens up. Who shows up first? Not the government. Merchants, traders, people with a nose for where the money is. Alaska had fish and furs, which meant it had business. Traders started buying pelts from indigenous communities and shipping them back to the Russian mainland. Then came the next step, the Russian-American Company. Think East India Company. Think Dutch West India Company. Russia built the same model, a royally chartered monopoly to extract everything Alaska had and sell it at profit on the mainland. A portion of shares reportedly went to the emperor himself. The company launched and took off fast. The Russian-American Company became, by most accounts, the single most profitable company in the entire Russian Empire, from a territory most people in St. Petersburg couldn't have found on a map. It was, for a while, genuinely a machine for printing money, which is exactly what makes the next part so strange. The fur trade was the core, but the colonists also pushed south to California, trading furs for food and supplies, whale baleen, whale oil, and ice, enormous blocks of it, cut from Alaskan glaciers and shipped to California for food storage because, in the mid-19th century, ice was a serious commodity. Restaurants, warehouses, anyone keeping anything cold through summer, Alaska had ice to spare. In return, the colonists got gunpowder, food, everything the territory couldn't grow itself. By 1853, a fully steam-powered ship had been launched at Novo-Arkhangelsk, the colonial capital. Built entirely from local materials, not a single part imported from Russia. The Orthodox Church had established a real presence. Many Aleuts and indigenous people had converted and were part of that parish. Two names behind all of this: Alexander Baranov and Grigory Shelikov. The men who built the company, structured the trade routes, turned a colonial outpost into the most profitable commercial operation in the empire.
They don't get statues. They probably should. And then the sea otter.
The Kalan, the sea otter, has dense fur, naturally waterproofed by oil from its own skin glands. Beautiful pelt, very valuable.
And the hunters went after it with absolutely zero restraint for decades. By the middle of the 19th century, the sea otter was functionally gone from Alaskan waters.
Go look this up, right now.
The sea otter is still on the vulnerable species list, still slowly recovering from hunting that happened 150 years ago.
The Russian-American company didn't just drive down the population. It wiped out the entire commercial basis of its own existence. The most profitable company in the empire had destroyed its own product. There, as a business school word for this, it's called eating your seed corn. The company optimized so hard for short-term extraction that it eliminated the thing generating the revenue. And nobody stopped it, because while it was happening, the money was great.
After the sea otters were gone, the problems compounded.
The merchants who had actually built the company were gradually pushed out of management and replaced with naval officers, disciplined men who understood command structures, but
not logistics or pricing.
Supply chains broke down. Cost controls fell apart. The same company that had been running at extraordinary margins was now running at a loss and borrowing from the state.
By the time of the sale, its debt to the Russian government stood at 722,000 rubles in gold.
The most profitable company in the empire had become a liability.
Meanwhile, the strategic map was shifting. Russia was annexing large new territories in the Far East, the Amur region, Primorye lands, that were contiguous with the empire, existing borders, reachable, defensible. That's where the political attention went. Alaska, across an ocean, on another continent, subsidized rather than profitable, started to feel like someone else's problem. And then American prospectors started crossing in. Gold had been found. Word traveled. Miners, settlers, adventurers arrived and stayed. Alaska was, geographically, far closer to California than to St. Petersburg. In 1853, the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia, Count Muravyov-Amursky, a sharp administrator with no patience for wishful thinking, sent a memo to the emperor. The argument was blunt. Russia was going to lose Alaska one way or another. His reasoning had three legs. Economically, the territory was a drain. Strategically, the United States had already bought Louisiana from France for $15 million and California from Mexico for $15 million. The pattern of American expansion was obvious to anyone paying attention. And militarily, The logistics of fighting a war in Alaska were simply impossible. Moving troops there from the Russian mainland was not a plan, it was a fantasy. His conclusion: sell it now, while it still has a price, and use the money to hold the Pacific coastline against British encroachment. That memo reached the right desk. 4 years later, in 1857, the emperor's own brother weighed in. Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich wrote to Alexander II, directly, without diplomatic softening, his argument: the United States was going to take Alaska eventually, with or without a sale.
He wrote in the letter itself, "These colonies bring us very little benefit, and the loss would not be too deeply felt."
Alexander read it and wrote in the margin, "This idea is worth thinking about."
Here's a detail that tends to get buried. Before approaching the Americans, the Russian side apparently made informal overtures to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg.
Whether that was a genuine negotiating probe, create a competing bidder, push Washington's price up, or whether someone in St. Petersburg had genuinely confused the size of Luxembourg with the size of the buyer they needed, history doesn't say. Luxembourg's reaction is not recorded.
Then came the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. Russia fought Britain and France and lost. The Treasury took a serious hit.
Alexander II was looking for 42 million rubles in foreign loans just to cover the deficit. Against that number, the 11 million the Alaska sale would eventually generate starts looking less like pocket change. There was also a geopolitical calculation running alongside the financial one. Russia and the United States had been quiet allies for a long time, both wary of British naval power, both with reasons to keep Britain occupied elsewhere. The Russian Empire had backed the American colonists during the Revolutionary War. During the Civil War, Russia would be the only major power to support the federal government outright. The Americans hadn't forgotten, and in St. Petersburg, everyone knew they hadn't. Selling Alaska to the Americans was also a way of making a friend.
2 more things pushed it over the edge. Food supply on Alaska had become erratic, hard to ship from Russia, disrupted during the Civil War even from California.
Colonists were going hungry, and the indigenous tribes, who had previously been fragmented, were forming coalitions. Real armies, real wars, costly ones with no obvious end.
Every factor was pointing the same direction. On the 16th of December, 1866, the final meeting on Alaska was held. Alexander II in person, Grand Duke Konstantin, Foreign Minister Gorchakov, Naval Minister Krabbe, Finance Minister Reitern, and Eduard Stoeckel, the Russian envoy to Washington. Stoeckel opened with the bad news. The Americans weren't particularly interested. Public opinion in the United States ranged from skeptical to hostile. Congress had other things on its mind. One newspaper had already printed that the purchase would mean acquiring 50,000 Eskimos, whose breakfast consisted of half a bucket of seal fat.
So, 2 moves. 1, a PR campaign. Make Alaska sound like El Dorado. Flood the American press with enthusiasm. 2, money for the right senators. $120,000 in what Stoeckel's dispatches carefully called press management and other expenses.
Stoeckel left for Washington with instructions to open at $5 million. He knew he'd be negotiated down, so he opened at $7,200,000 instead. $5 million in context. 12 southern states plus Louisiana had been purchased from France for $15 million. California alone from Mexico for $15 million. $5 million for Alaska was not an insulting offer. It was a fair one. Talks started the 5th of March, 1867. Weeks of back and forth. Stoeckel managing the press, paying senators, working Seward, the Secretary of State, a genuine expansionist who wanted this deal from the other side. The treaty was signed on the 30th of March, 1867. Don't think of this as a list of islands. Think of it as a list of things that would make the United States extraordinarily wealthy, handed over for what amounted to a rounding error on the imperial budget. The entire Alaskan peninsula, the Alexander Archipelago, hundreds of islands, fisheries that today supply a substantial portion of all the seafood consumed in North America. The Aleutian chain, stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers across the Pacific, a geographic bridge between continents, a military position so strategically important that during the Second World War, Japan invaded and occupied 2 of those islands, and the United States fought a serious campaign to get them back. The Pribilof Islands, where the fur seal population nearly as decimated as the sea otter would eventually recover and become a regulated, profitable harvest. And underneath it all, oil fields that today pump hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. Gold deposits that had produced close to 1,000 tons by the mid-20th century. The Red Dog Mine in northern Alaska, 10% of global zinc output. Total, over 1.5 million square kilometers. $7,200,000, 2 cents an acre. The Russian-American company was notified on the 19th of April. The Senate ratified on the 3rd of May. On the 18th of October, 1867, at 3:30 in the afternoon, Alaska became American territory.
There's a story about the handover ceremony in Novoarkhangelsk, renamed Sitka, that same day, where the Russian flag got tangled in the rigging as they lowered it.
A sailor climbed up to free it, lost his grip, fell onto the Russian bayonets below.
There is a companion story that the American flag also refused to cooperate, tangled in the ropes, then torn by a gust of wind. Whether both stories are true, one or neither Alaska apparently did not want to change hands, but it did.
Most colonists were evacuated back to Russia. Around 200 stayed.
Some accounts say only 15 went through formal naturalization, which at the time meant saying, "I'll serve under the American flag," in front of 2 witnesses. No waiting period. Instant citizenship.
The American commander who entered Sitka reportedly ordered all remaining Russians out of their homes. There are accounts of soldiers looting the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael.
The final check was handed to Stoeckel on the 1st of August.
Myth 1. Russia never actually got paid.
The story. $7,200,000 in gold was loaded onto a ship called the Orkney,
which sailed from a British port toward St. Petersburg. Mid-voyage, it exploded. 50 dead, 100 wounded.
An American named William Thompson was identified as the saboteur,
but was never brought to justice. He disappeared and died shortly after from a wound infection. No gold recovered.
No ship recovered. The money simply disappeared. It is a good story. None of it happened. $120,000 went to Stoeckel for bribes and press work. The rest, 11,362,000 rubles, at the exchange rate of the time, was used to buy railway components in Europe, the Kursk-Kiev line, the Ryazan-Kozlov line, the Moscow-Ryazan line. The money went into track. Here is what that tells you about the scale of the deal. Annual state expenditures for the Russian Empire at the time, around 400 million rubles. The Alaska money was 11 million, less than 3% of 1 year's spending. It did not close the deficit. It did not stabilize anything. It bought some railway track and covered maybe a quarter of the emergency loan the government was already seeking. That is what 1.5 million square kilometers of the most resource-rich land in North America was worth to the Russian balance sheet in 1867. A line item. Myth 2. It was a lease. 99 years. The Americans owe it back. This one has been running since roughly 1868. The logic borrows from Hong Kong Britain's 99-year lease from China and applies it backward onto Alaska.
After the sale, someone apparently started the rumor, "Do not worry, they will give it back."
It attached itself to a real date, the 3rd of January, 1959, when Alaska became the 49th state. The legend says that is when the lease expired, and that Khrushchev told Kennedy to keep it.
No such document exists. No lease agreement.
No Alaska correspondence between Khrushchev and Kennedy, only the Cuban Missile Crisis letters. The signed treaties from 1867 are explicit. A permanent sale. Alaska was sold. That is the document.
The lease story is a coping mechanism, understandable, but there is nothing underneath it.
Myth 3. It was a conspiracy. Russia was cheated.
The process was genuinely messy. Bribes, press management, total secrecy for months.
When it became public in the summer of 1867, the reaction was ugly. One publisher wrote, "Shall the labors of Shelikov, Baranov, and other selfless men benefit only foreigners?" A saying circulated, "It was not a barn they sold."
The criticism was real. It was also quickly buried. But conspiracy is not the right word for what happened. Alexander II made the decision deliberately, with full knowledge of the arguments, surrounded by the empire's most senior ministers. The strategic reasoning was coherent. The financial reasoning was coherent. Russia sold something it believed it was going to lose anyway, and took a price rather than taking nothing. That is not a conspiracy. That is just a painful deal. Now, the part that is hard to sit with. 1880. Largest ore deposit in Alaska found at Juneau. Early 20th century. The largest placer gold deposit in North America found in Alaska. Jack London's gold rush stories, those were about Alaska. By the mid-20th century, Alaska had produced close to 1,000 tons of gold. Today, it ranks second in the United States in gold output, second in oil output. The Red Dog mine alone, 10% of global zinc production. By the 1920s, Alaska had generated $200 million in profit for the United States. It was purchased for $7,200,000. And this is the moment where everyone says, how did they not know? But I think that framing is wrong, and it matters that it is wrong. In 1867, oil was a medicine and a lamp fuel. The internal combustion engine did not exist. Nobody had conceived of petroleum as the thing industrial civilization would run on that was 30 years away.
The Klondike gold had not been found. The sea otters were gone. The company was bankrupt.
A rational person in that room, working with the information available in 1867, would have made the same call. Every single one of them. We look back with the knowledge of what was underground and call it stupidity. That is not fair. It is not even accurate. What it was bad luck. Specifically, the bad luck of making a correct decision about a known situation without knowing that the ground was about to become the most valuable thing in the room. So, why was Alaska sold? 3 things, and none of them are complicated.
The Russian-American company was bankrupt.
The Sea Otters were gone. The monopoly was broken.
The most profitable business in the empire had become a state liability. Russia had just lost the Crimean War. The Treasury was empty.
New territories in the Far East, geographically attached to the mainland, needed money and attention.
Alaska was on another continent.
And everyone who thought it through clearly reached the same conclusion. The Americans were going to get Alaska. Eventually, the Monroe Doctrine manifests destiny. The flood of American prospectors already settling there, it was coming. Better to name a price than to lose a war. No Catherine the Great. She would been dead 70 years. No 99-year lease. No ship full of gold that sank in the North Sea. No Khrushchev Kennedy phone call. Just this. The second most oil-rich state in America, the second most gold productive, a territory that generates billions annually sold for the cost of a modest country estate. Not out of stupidity, not out of corruption, because in 1867 the ground was just ground, and a bankrupt company on another continent was not worth a war. A difficult decision. Reasonable men. Terrible timing.
The tragedy is not that anyone got cheated.
The tragedy is that the oil and the gold and the zinc were all sitting there the whole time and nobody knew to look. That is it. That is the whole story. Subscribe to my channel.